Okay, so this is our last meeting. We are finishing here on finishing out how do you minister to people who, in the lens of spiritual warfare. And we kind of started to lay out last week that spiritual warfare and gospel ministry are not totally distinct things, right? They very much overlap, or maybe even, or go hand in hand. And I think we'll see some more of that today. We talked a lot last week about the idea that as we seek to understand where demonic dark powers might be at work, we have to be very thoughtful of that. We have to listen very carefully to our own souls, to other people, because humans are complex creatures with a whole bunch of different facets of their being, and that means that there's many sort of avenues of attack, as it were, right? So we mapped out biological, psychological, spiritual, emotional, social, all of these aspects of human life, and we did that so that we could understand that in all of these spheres of human experience, there are hurts or fears or vulnerabilities that the devil can exploit and can use. And so now, though, how do we know if there really is a particular kind of demonic presence in affecting a person or influencing a person? And that's where we're going to conclude this. So we're looking at marks of demonic presence, okay? Now, one of the things I'll note again, the Bible, unfortunately, does not present us a neat and clean list of symptoms by which to diagnose demonic influence. We can just do a quick survey. The biblical portrayal of people who are sort of demonically influenced is quite varied, actually, right? So I think a lot of times we think a person is demonically influenced, and we think of, say, like The Exorcist or something, and we like the heads turning around and crazy stuff like that. And that's really not at least the most common way that the Bible portrays demonic oppression. So we go, to Mark chapter 9 and verse 32. Oh, shoot, that's not the right spot. Oh, no. Okay, I got the wrong reference here, and that's a bummer. I'll figure out that reference and correct it in the notes. But a passage where... No, don't put down Mark 9. It'll be in the notes. I got it mixed up in my notes. But the man is mute. It's a demonically oppressed man. And the way that how that manifests is he can't speak. Right? So that's not particularly volatile. It's just a guy that can't speak, right? Let's see if my next reference makes more sense. Yeah, so here, Matthew 17, here we have a boy who is oppressed by a demon. And for him, how it manifests is he has seizures. And often he falls into fire and often into water. So now we are told elsewhere that seizures does not mean demon, right? But here it looks like that's what the demon did to him. Is it convulsed him and it caused him to fall into, fire or fall into water. Is dangerous for him. Sometimes you've got really the dramatic display of kind of wild behavior or violence. So if we go to Mark chapter 5, for example, this guy is oppressed by really a legion of demons, we're told. But this is how he looks. He lives in the tombs, lives in a graveyard, and no one can bind him anymore, not even with a chain, for he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart. And he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs on the mountains, he's crying out, he's cutting himself with stones, self-harm. And then when he comes to Jesus, he cries out with a loud voice and he's shouting, and it's wild, right? We see a similar kind of violence of manifestation in Luke chapter 9. Come down here to verse 42. So this time, teacher, I beg you to look at my son. He is my only child. Behold, a spirit seizes him, and he suddenly cries out. It convulses him, so he foams at the mouth and shatters him and will hardly leave him. And then that's exactly what happens. When Jesus confronts it, the demon threw him to the ground and convulsed him. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit and healed the boy. So sometimes it's presented like that, right? But sometimes there is demonic presence, and it manifests in no such crazy, blatant outward sign, but rather in a sort of calm intent to do evil. So, for example, in John chapter 13, they're sitting down at the table, and we're told Satan entered into Judas. And then Jesus said to him, what you're going to do quickly. No one at the table knew why this was said to him. So he gets out of the room. He goes, he gets a bunch of people, and then what does Judas do? He comes back, finds them in the garden, and is he frothing at the mouth? Is he turning his head all the way around? Is he doing... No, he comes up and he very rationally says, like, there's the guy. I'll give him a kiss of friendship and you can get him. Very calm, like level-headed, but satanic, right? So we see the same thing in Acts chapter 5. Early part of the church where people are selling their properties and giving the proceeds to the apostles so that they can have, the ability to provide rations for the early church. And here we have this couple who conspire, like completely premeditatedly and completely irrationally conspire to deceive the apostles in the church, right? A man named Ananias with his wife Sapphira sold a piece of property, and with his wife's knowledge, he kept back for himself some of the proceeds and brought only a part of it and laid it at the apostles' feet. And then we find out from this story that the problem is not that he just brings a part of it. It's that he brings a part of it and represents it as the whole. And so he lies, right? And then Peter says, Ananias, and then look at this. Why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit? So is there demonic influence there? Absolutely. How does it show up? In a way that no one would have been able to discern except by the supernatural discernment given to Peter. Like Peter knows, right, what these folks have done. And how does he know that? Well, presumably the Holy Spirit told him and told him these people are trying to lie to you, trying to lie to God. And so the point for our purposes there is that when you're trying to assess for a demonic presence, it's not that like, well, there's only demonic powers present if a person is like going crazy. That's not true at all. In the biblical testimony, sometimes there is satanic presence, influence, and it shows up in a very level-headed, cunning deceitfulness. Does that make sense? And then you would also see 1 Corinthians chapter 10, demonic influence here shows up as just what we might say is like ordinary run-of-the-mill idolatry. Paul says, therefore, my beloved, the Corinthian church, flee from idolatry. I speak as to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? And the answer to that rhetorical question is, yes, it is. The cup of blessing that we bless is a participation in the blood of Christ. By the way, that's a really great note about communion. We do communion every Sunday. And when we take that little cup, it is a participation in the blood of Christ. Wonderful thing to meditate on and ponder. The bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? Yes, it is. Because there is one bread, We who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. Again, it's a fantastic passage to meditate on for communion and what we're doing and gather as a church. Verse 18, consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices participants in the altar? And that's his kind of point. He's saying, yes, they are. When we eat of the bread and the wine, we are a participant in what is being talked about there. So what do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything? Or that an idol is anything? No. No, in the sense that that's a little statue right there. Is that a god, that little statue? No. However, that little statue is a representation of a being that is falsely presumed to be a god, and what that being is, says Paul, is a demon. Okay? So then he says, I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. Now we're talking about demonic influence here, right? I don't want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? So here, it's idolatry is demonic influence. Do you see that? So all of these marks, like how do we know if we're dealing with demonic powers when we're ministering to people, when we're considering our own walk with Christ, our own soul? Well, how a demonic influence could show up could be quite varied. That's the point in doing that little survey there. And we should not think, well, nobody's frothing at the mouth, so there's nothing demonic going on here. That's my point. Okay? So what should we listen for, especially in a life story, as we think about, is there demonic influence here? Okay? And again, let me say something by way of pause here. When I say there's demonic influence, I'm not saying that the person that is demonically influenced is so terrible and wicked because they're being attacked by a demon. Does that make sense? It's not a moral insult at somebody to say there's spiritual warfare happening around your soul right now. That's not insult, right? So Satan attacked Job for no reason. No sin of Job, right? So it is not a sin to be the subject of a demonic attack. It is a sin to yield to that attack and participate with demons. Yes? Okay, so that's what we're after here. I'm not trying to, this is not to shame people. If you're ever talking to somebody and you're thinking, wow, spiritual warfare here, one of the most destructive, harmful things you could do is come out of the gate and be like, gosh, you're really terrible because none of you folks would do that, I don't think. But you get the point there. It's not a moral accusation to say, I think there might be a demonic element to this attack that's coming to you.
Just a question.
Yes.
When you're talking about like physical possession and seizures and epilepsy, I have a handicapped grandson that is prone to seizures.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I don't want to look at him and think that he's...
No, and I wouldn't.
Yeah, so,
I wouldn't.
mean, is that even something that we, on this side of eternity, can even make a judgment call when we see someone with some kind of a... Unless it's like an obvious out of their mind frothing at the mouth, howling at the moon, that sort of kind of thing?
Well, so what I'll say is, so I certainly would not look at a person who is suffering from epilepsy and say, well, that's a demon right there. And again, because the biblical data even says that these are different things. Because we've seen different passages like people who are sick and people who are ill and people who had seizures and people who are oppressed by demons. Like those are different categories. Now, sometimes what a demon will do is it will provoke symptoms of some other category as well. But I don't think that's you don't look at a person with epilepsy and conclude like, oh, there's a demon there that I have to like exorcise or something like that. That's not what we're doing.
And that's not something that even, I think that's our right?
No.
Or, responsibility, if you will?
Yeah. And what I would say there is that we look for some other marks as well to say, and this is why we've spent so much time looking at like, well, what is the devil trying to actually even do? Because in the end, like that's what it is. The devil is trying to deceive and accuse and tempt and sever the connection of people with God. I do not think that the chief way that he is doing that in our culture today is by blatant demonstrations of supernatural wild power. I think he does it quite a bit more through insidious, subtle, convincing deceit, lies. Frankly, modernism, I think. So, yes, does that make sense there? Now, so let's look at some of the things to look for that might clue us in that, okay, there's a peculiar demonic attack here. One obvious one would be an occultic history. Okay, so many people in the church, we've grown up and never had anything to do with this, and we think it's not a thing. It absolutely is a thing, right? People have histories of participation in various kinds of spiritual activities that, from the biblical perspective, are simply appeals to demonic spirits. So people who have done like Ouija boards, or people who have done certain kinds of yoga practices. And I say certain kinds because this question came up, some weeks ago or months ago. Yoga is such a goofy thing to talk about because when people say yoga, oftentimes what they just very simply mean is stretching. I don't think that you're infested by a demon from stretching, okay? Yoga proper is actually a bunch of sort of spiritual, mental, cognitive practices that are hitched to stretching, to specific kind of movements of the body. I'm talking about that. That can be a avenue by which a demon begins to exert real serious influence. Same kind of thing with, and this is again something that might be more present in our region here, certain like sweat lodge rituals that appeal to spirits, like fortune telling, psychics, this kind of thing. When there's been participation, and now it's not magic in the sense that it's not that a person did this thing, so now a demon has like the right to take up residence in their soul, right? We've covered that. When a person comes to Christ, every vow they've ever made to any dark power is rendered null and void. Their authority is broken. They have no authority now, in reality. However, they can use a person's past experiences, pains, trauma, sins, to essentially bluff in a highly convincing way that they do still belong to them, right? So a person, who years ago participated in some kind of dark occult ritual and made some kind of actual deal or vow, and they become a Christian now, we would say two things. One is that vow they made has no legal binding authority at all. But they could still be convinced that it does. Does that make sense? Because that is the voice of the demon. They come and say, well, you made that deal way back when, and don't think that just because you went and got baptized, now you're out from my hand. You're not. It's that kind of thing, right? So occultic history. Another thing, especially to listen for in a life story. Again, broad thing, a life story. And it's good to ask people about their lives. Although most people don't like to actually really deeply talk about their lives. And that's some of the trick of ministry, is encouraging people to feel safe enough to talk about their life, really. But the other thing to listen to, especially for, is trauma. And what I mean there is the presence of profound pain or deep fears. Now, it is not sinful to have trauma, right? It's not sinful to be afraid. It's not sinful to have pain. The problem is that the presence of severe, significant trauma can make it especially difficult for a person to think clearly, even about the gospel and the Word of God. So what ends up happening is significant trauma in a person's life will often result in a severe emotional pain and or deep-seated fear that will make a person particularly unwilling to go to certain places, right? To ask certain questions, to consider certain truths. So someone who's experienced significant loss and has not ever process through that in the gospel, in Christ. That person may be unwilling to even consider certain truths, certain questions. So say, for example, Isaac and Abraham, we talked about on Sunday. God comes to Abraham and he says something to him that is unbelievable, right? And Abraham has the faith to just go with God. It's wild. It's like, God, wherever you're taking me right now, I have no idea. But you're good and I trust you and we'll go there. Okay, what I'm saying here is that really severe trauma can make it very difficult for a person to really do that. Where there are certain things where it's like, I wouldn't even ask God that question because I'm not ready to hear the answer. Does that make sense? And the problem with that then is that can be easily exploited by demons. Because what will happen then is people have essentially, the voice of God has been tuned out for them in these certain spheres of life. And here comes a demon that will say to them things that appeal to their fear or appeal to their hurt. Does that make sense?
So it's like a doorway or like
Yeah.
an avenue.
It's an avenue to deceive. So we talked about last week, listening for these very deep-seated, I use the language of vows. Sometimes people make vows, and it's not an occultic ritual. It's like a deep psychological conviction that people come to. And so, for example, they're betrayed by, they're humiliated by a spouse, by a significant other. And they make a deep-seated vow that they will therefore never trust another woman again, another man again. So now what this has is there's an area of trauma in a life where there are certain questions they will not be willing to ask very easily. Does that make sense? And that's a place of exploitation. Because if you hold in your mind like, people, I don't think people can be trusted. Here's another one. There are people, I've talked to people who will say they have a very hard time trusting anybody. And the reason for that is severe, significant trauma in their life. Now, the problem is, if a person's just like, I just can't trust anybody, they're going to self-isolate themselves. And now the devil's going to come and there's going to be certain lies that are all the more appealing to that person, particularly because they're not willing to hear the voice of God. They're not willing to hear the voice of the church. They're not willing to hear the voice of friends who love them in Christ. And so what will happen is demons will come and they'll start saying stuff like, you really can't trust people. You can only really rely on yourself, right? And if God comes along and wants to suggest to them, yes, people let you down. So, but you have to live life. What if God suggests to a person that they have to open themselves up to human connection again? They're not even willing to ask the question of, if I do that and I get deeply wounded again, can I still trust God? Do you see what I'm saying there? Or people with, like a chronic illness that has become a deep fear to them. They might be unwilling to ask this question. What if I am sick like this for the rest of my life? Can I still trust God? Is he still good? Right? So my point is as we think about life and listen to people, one of the things to listen for where then there might be a exploitation of dark powers is severe trauma will render a person vulnerable to specific kinds of deceit and lies. Is that making sense? I can't give an exhaustive, every possible way that could look. But trauma will present people, I think, with at least the potential of a cognitive, emotional blind spot. And with that in place, it's an exploitive avenue. Okay? So trauma. Now, some of the other marks of demonic presence: accusing and or tempting voices. So remember, two of the chief weapons of the devil are accusation and temptation. This is not to say that all temptation or accusation is coming directly from the mouth of a demon. I'm not saying that, right? Everybody has their own negative self-talk, right? Yes? Everybody sometimes gets down on themselves. I'm not saying every time that you're down on yourself, frustrated with yourself, then that's a demon. I'm not saying that. We are perfectly capable of sinking to quite low depths without the assistance of Satan or demons. All on our own, yeah. People sometimes, and we spoke to this a little bit last week, sometimes we internalize the voice of other people who have, again, inflicted trauma on us. We have a tendency as human beings to magnify the voice of the most destructive people in our lives and minimize the voice of the most loving, good, compassionate people in our lives. And so oftentimes how that then looks is a person will internalize literally internalize the voice of somebody else. So that every time they hear some negative thing in their own soul, it sounds like that person that was getting down on them all the time. It might be a parent, like a disappointed parent. It might be a spouse. It might be a boss. It might be like a particularly effective bully. Some people are so tormented in their young years by a particularly effective, nasty bully that go into their adult lives and they hear that person's voice ringing around in their head for years on end. And that's not necessarily a demon. Now, that's an area of trauma that would be easily exploited by a demon, right? That's not necessarily a demon. It's not necessarily a demon every time that we are tempted. So if we go to James chapter 1, we're given a really stiff rebuke by James here. He says, let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God. Okay? God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. It's an extraordinarily foolish thing when someone says, I'm being tempted to do that evil thing, and it's God. Like, God is testing me to, or with that temptation to eat. No, that's totally not true. Okay? The same word there in Greek means to test or to tempt. It's two sides of the same coin. So there's a play on words here, is that we should not, when we are tempted, say that this is God doing this to test me. No, God does not do that. He does not put evil in front of you to try to test you or tempt you or anything like that. Well, then how are we tempted? James tells us in verse 14. Each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by what? Not demons, his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. So it's from our own hearts that temptation comes. We have desires, and those desires lure and entice us. They give birth to sin, and that brings forth death. So it's not necessarily a demon. And this gives us kind of actually a very good principle. Demons do not create out of thin air. Demons exploit what is already present. Okay? So when you are tempted, at no point can you say, the devil made me do it. Never. Because the devil did not manifest out of thin air your desire to do that wicked thing. So what is the devil, what do demons do with this? Well, what they do is they come and they have profoundly accurate insight into you and the wicked things that you already are ready to commit. Okay?
Exploiting those sinful desires.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So they already know that I have a temper, right? They don't create anger in me. They know there's already a willingness to meet a real injustice or a perceived injustice with anger. And that may or may not be a bad thing, but they are then able to come in and intensify that and magnify it and make, right? So they don't, like their accusations, in other words, are potent because people have actually sinned. And so when the devil comes, when the demon comes and gives an accusation, a voice of accusation, he's not creating guilt out of thin air. He's pouncing on some kind of guilt you already feel and then exploiting it and lying to you about it and doing something wicked with it to provoke you to move away from God rather than toward him. Does that make sense? But their accusation doesn't land with you because you're innocent and they're just that convincing. Their accusation lands because we are guilty and we don't really believe the gospel sometimes. Right? That's how it works. Or on the temptation, their temptation does not create a wicked desire out of nothing. Their temptation is powerful because people already have errant desires. We have desires for wrong things. We have desires for right things, but to get them in wrong ways or at wrong times. And then the temptation of demonic powers come and prey upon that already present desire and lie to you about appropriate ways to pursue it, right? So you think about the person who, for example, is like addicted to pornography. I think there's demonic influence there, for sure. But the demonic influence is not creating the addiction. What the demonic influence is doing is it's pouncing on what's already there, a desire for fulfillment, intimacy, satisfaction of some sort, right? And then presenting a path to that is a path away from God. It's a path to immediate gratification. It's a path to get what a person wants in the wrong way at the wrong time. But it's not creating the desire, okay? And you could just do that like with anything. With anything. Demons don't manufacture anything. Okay. So, if accusing and or tempting voices are not necessarily demonic voices, how do we know whether there's a demon there that's doing something? Well, there's two marks that'll help us with that. Number one, people at times experience a voice that is differentiated from the person themselves. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean a person is crazy. Sometimes you'll talk to people and they'll be hearing a voice of accusation, of lying, of fear, of temptation. And as you talk to them, like you could ask questions like this. Like you're talking to somebody and they're talking about, man, they're just hearing like terrible things about, okay, do you hear the voice right now? What is it saying? Is that voice you? And people have a ability to, like you, if you're talking to somebody, you won't know. You're not hearing whatever kind of voice people are hearing in your soul, that they're hearing in their soul. And so you don't know. Is it a demon? Is it not a demon? But if you ask people like that voice that you're hearing, we'll talk about some of the things that it says. But you can ask people, is that you or is it someone else? And people will have a sense of like, it's not me. Okay? That's one mark. It's differentiated from the person. The second mark would be violent, and I don't necessarily mean violent like physical violence, but like volatile opposition to Christ and to the gospel. Now again, I'm not saying that a person is, I'm saying that a demon is. So remember the guy in Mark chapter 5. The demon flips its lid when it encounters Christ. But the man, when he sees Jesus, he runs to him. It's a beautiful picture, really. So the idea here is that it's not that a person is opposed to Christ necessarily, but there is something in them or around them or speaking to them. And when you try to, well, It's what's in the Gospels. When demons are when they're looked at in the name of Christ, they freak out. That's what we see in the Gospels, right? They fuzz. Remember, we use that term. And so, likewise, demons will present a volatile, stiff resistance, opposition to Christ. Along with that, demons have personhood. Trauma doesn't. What I mean by that is not to say that trauma is not personal. It totally is. Trauma does not typically take on a personhood of its own. Does that make sense? And so when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about addressing a thing, an event, an experience, a feeling, a thing, right? That thing doesn't have personhood. And so it won't necessarily react with violent opposition to Christ, versus when we're talking about a demon, we're not talking about a what, we're talking about a who. It has personhood. Personhood that stands with extraordinary animosity to Christ. And that'll show up as you talk to people. Okay? So what are some of these voices that people hear from demons, accusation or temptation? So accusation, you'll hear people who walk around all day long, and in their head, they're hearing things like, you're a fat pig. You're a fraud. You can't do anything right. You're not making anyone's life better. Right? Nasty, terrible, accusatory thing. Like, all you've ever done is wrong things. Like accusation, the finger pointing, right? Or the temptation would be something like, you're never going to be rid of this. Just give into it. The only way that you're going to resolve this feeling is if you just give into it. Or something like, they don't or wouldn't understand. You need this. You deserve this. Whatever kinds of things like that. A whole host of other kinds of things that people would hear. Now, these accusing voices in particular are often typically also quite literally the voice of death. So it would be something like, you can't do anything right. You're not making anyone's life. Why are you even alive? Right? Or sometimes you should just kill yourself. Like it's the voice of death. And this is not a person, their own voice. This is it is the voice of accusation, the voice of death. Okay? So, major mark, accusatory, tempting voices. Another major mark of demonic presence or influence is, we would summarize this by referring to something like an oppressive presence. Okay? So sometimes people are walking around, they're living, they're going to bed at night, and they are feeling a real, overwhelmingly oppressive, dominating presence. Right? Demons seek power over people. And so that can manifest in a sense of a terrifying or oppressive manifestation. Now again, the sensation of an oppressive presence is not necessarily demonic. There are ways that physiological things happen with people that can manifest in very frightening ways. So for example, sometimes fear can be so potent and profound that it manifests as a hallucinatory projection. Okay? There are physiological symptoms that can be interpreted in quite the terrifying way. For example, I did a deep dive into this because it's so interesting. So there's something called sleep paralysis, okay, or REM atonia. What this is it's the idea that REM atonia is where the body experiences a muscle paralysis during REM sleep, and that's a good thing for the body. It's what prevents people ordinarily from sleepwalking, right? It's a safety measure. It's a way of the body preventing itself from physically acting out when they are dreaming, which is a good thing, right? So if you ever had a dream where you're like fighting some monster, you don't want to like punch your spouse in the face in the middle of the night. So that's what it is. Now, but what can happen though is that as people are falling asleep or waking up, the brain and body don't always turn on or shut off all at the same time. Okay? So there's what they connected to this, they call it the hypnagogic state. And it is that state where a person, some parts of your brain shut off before others as you become drowsy. You kind of notice this, right? You get drowsy and it's almost like that state where you're like sort of barely perceive stuff still, but you're not totally awake. So your brain is kind of powering down, but at different rates. So all that to say, what can happen is that sometimes a person can be in a state where the mind can be totally awake, but the body has the sleep paralysis. Again, usually as a person is waking up or going to sleep, but what it can then have is they have a conscious experience of the sleep paralysis. And normally we don't have that. And some people perceive that as a terrifying, oppressive presence. It feels to them like they're laying in their bed and like a massive thing is like laying on top of them and they can't move. And it's absolutely terrifying to people. Now, that's not a demon as such in that scenario, right? But nonetheless, one mark of demonic presence will be a certain degree of the perception of a dominating power. And again, it doesn't need to be an outright display of like strange supernatural phenomena. Rather, it might be for some people a strong internal sense that there is a force, particularly a personal force, that is exerting a will counter to their own to dominate them. And people experience this. Now, what I would say is we would put all of these things together. No one of these marks or signs would be like, oh, look, there's a demon there. And it's not even that we say, like, I have conclusively scientifically come to the view that there's a demon. That's not what we're doing. What we're saying is we want to be sensitive to the idea that there are spiritual problems as well as, sort of biological or emotional problems. We want to be aware of the not only possibility but likelihood that the devil is, by way of all of his legions, waging war for people's souls. And so you start putting multiple of these things together, and it might give you a picture that, okay, there's something more going on here than, just like a physiological issue. There might be some greater thing. So how do we minister to such folks? How do we confront demonic and minister to the oppressed? Okay, number one, treatment of any malady will often need to be multimodal. I wish we had more of this in our culture today. Multimodal. What I mean by that is that, again, people are complex creatures, and so really healing the soul is not a straightforward thing. And everybody divided into their, we live in a culture that is hyper-specialized. Okay? So professional people go into their careers and they go into ever more hyper-specialized places where at worst, they start to think that nearly every problem that a human faces gets traced back to this thing that I have hyper-specialized in, right? Or at best, we become so hyper-fixated on these various specialties that there's no communication between various people, experts, specialists, whatever. And so what can happen then is that we can have a very one-dimensional approach to actually healing people. So one of the ways that shows up in our culture today is a over propensity to just throw pharmaceuticals at everything, right? So now, I am not saying that there's no point whatsoever to a medicine, pharmaceutical. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that if you have a headache that you should just pray about it. If you have a bad headache, maybe you should take some Tylenol. That's all right. Okay? But our culture can be, so one of the best examples of this is right now, the push toward Ozempic, right? For all kinds of health things. It's not just a weight loss thing. It's a whole host of medical things. And it's just like we are going to spend like hundreds of billions of dollars on pushing this pharmaceutical. The problems that this pharmaceutical addresses or allegedly addresses could also be met by like a good diet and right activity and all these other things, okay? So that's my criticism of our culture. For us, treatment, like healing people, humans who are soulish, embodied creatures, has to be multimodal: physical, mental, emotional, social, spiritual. So this is something we need to reclaim in the church too. We should be encouraging one another to seek fullness of life in Christ in all of life's facets, okay? So part of that is physical, diet, activity, sometimes medication, whatever kinds of things. I have begun to talk a little bit more about this just even in our church, because I've gone all my life and I've never heard pastors talk about why Christians ought to pursue a decent physical well-being and the wise and good and right ways to do that. But that's part of who we are. We are physical creatures. We're embodied creatures. And we should steward our bodies and be responsibly take care of our bodies. More to the point is treating real maladies of the human person require multiple things. A mental emotional piece, we sometimes need counseling. We need cognitive behavioral therapy. That's not a weird postmodern, but a actually wise contemporary counseling strategy. It actually is very much aligns with principles of Christian faith. Cognitive behavioral therapy is basically this idea that you have at any given point your thoughts, feelings, and actions. Okay, I'm way oversimplifying this. Of your thoughts, feelings, and actions, you are next to incapable of changing your feelings, right? Have you ever been angry and just tried to will yourself not to be angry? There's very little ability to do that. We have a little bit better, but still not very good ability to alter our thoughts. It's really hard to change people's minds. Really hard to change our own mind, right? So of those three facets of your being, the one that you have the most easy direct control over is your actions. Okay? The problem that we have is that we usually only want to do actions when our heart and mind has already gotten there. Right? But those two things are the most difficult things for us to get in order. So cognitive behavioral therapy today is the practice of helping people see what kinds of unhealthy, dysfunctional things they believe, how their feelings are important but sometimes errant and infallible and all of this, and the kinds of habits that they have that aren't helping them and the kind of habits that they can engage in that would help them. This is very much Christian faith. God doesn't say, do it when your heart gets around to it. God says, do it and your heart will get around to it. Does that make sense? And there's so many different places where that's applicable. So mental, emotional, social, people need a supportive, compassionate, edifying social network. I so believe that the local church is the hope of the world, largely for this reason. Not only for this reason, but largely for this reason. I tell everybody, you should be a committed, known, participating member of a local church. Why? Because you have to have a place where you are known, where you are cared for, where people can tell you your sin so that you can see it and repent of it. Right? Like, you have to have that place. One of the deepest heartaches of my ministry career has been marriage counseling. I don't like doing marriage counseling. And the reason is that most of the time, it's not for members of our church, and it doesn't work. And most of the time, the reason that it doesn't work is that a couple comes in, and I don't know at all who they are because they haven't been part of the community for a long time. And so I really don't know what in the world is going on. And they give me conflicting stories, and I don't know who to believe. So I try to talk with folks. I try to point them to the gospel. But my effort there is seriously hampered by the fact that I have no way to verify really what's going on at all. And so it's extraordinarily difficult. So I have counseled people always. You need to go be part of a local church where people know you. So then if you start having real issues in life, you're not some stranger that people have no idea what's going on with you. They do know your life story. They know you. And they're going to be, much better set up to actually minister to you and help you. Okay, social. And then spiritual. Prayer, worship, scripture, communion with God. More than anything, I think what we need is the presence of God. So let me give you an example of this. You might have a person who has, say, substance abuse. What does healing look like for a person with substance abuse? Well, you might say there'd be a physical element of that because their body's been compromised by the substance. You might say there's a mental and emotional compartment of that because you might ask the question, what causes a substance to be abused in the first place? Right? What trauma is there that has gone unaddressed? Where does a person hurt so badly that they self-medicate? That type of stuff, right? There'd be a social element. Does a person have real friends that they can call when they're feeling an urge to use that substance? And then there'd be the spiritual. How does the gospel address the cause of their substance abuse? How can a person be healed by walking with Jesus? So when we are seeking to minister to people who are demonically oppressed, you might say there, like person with substance abuse, what lies have they believed from demons that have perpetuated this problem or that gave rise to it in the first place? And spiritual warfare there would be addressing all of that to heal a whole person. Okay? Thoughts, questions on that? Okay. Lastly, if and when you are ministering to somebody and you come... If and when you are ministering to somebody, you're praying for somebody, you have an opportunity to give good counsel to somebody, and you become pretty convinced that there is a demon present with them, how do you confront that? Confront. So the confirmation, I mean, you're never going to have absolute certainty, but you might confirm it by, I would never suggest to a person like, yeah, it sounds like you probably have a demon. I would not. What I would do is I would talk. Like, so if somebody came to my office and they're really struggling, what I would do is I would say, tell me your story. Well, where do I start? Wherever you want. Right? Wherever you want. Because we'll meander around and that's fine. Tell me your story. And as they tell their story, I'm listening to all these different areas of their life. How's their health? How are their relationships, their core key relationships? What things do they believe, right? One of our neighbors, for example, their little child had some sickness stuff. And at one point, just talking to him, listening to what they said. And at one point they said, yeah, well, we just, you send good vibes out into the universe and it comes back, right? Now here, listen, you guys, it's not, I understand why we find that amusing. It's not amusing though. People, they believe that. And it's like they hope that with every fiber of their being. Like, we've just tried the best we can to be good folks. Isn't that going to come back and redound to our benefit? And it's like, well, I don't think the universe is all that trustworthy. So my point is that you're listening. And you're like, okay, what sort of beliefs does this person have? Where is their trust and hope? What kind of history do they have? Is there deep hurt? Is there pain? Is there trauma? Is it how do you unpack that? That's what I would do. I wouldn't suggest to them you have a demon. I would listen. And then I would try to unpack some of the things that, kind of I mentally flag as I talk to people. Like, that's something I want to ask some more about. I want to hear more about that time of their life and what happened there. I want to hear more about their experience there with their parent or something. So we're not trying to pronounce that. Over the course of that, it might be like, so how? I mean, it sounds like you're carrying that around still, right? Or maybe it's none of that. Maybe it's a person I start talking to them and they're just quite obviously extremely self-loathing. And I might just like, hey, where is that coming from? And I might ask, like, well, where are you getting that from? Where are you getting such horrible things about yourself from? Why do you think that? And I might try to figure out, like, well, are they just a really extreme negative self-talk? Or, maybe it becomes clear in a conversation that they're honestly hearing a voice saying horrendous things to them that seem compelling. And I just talk with people, and over time I'd be looking for, not do I think this person has a demon, do they think maybe they do? Does that make sense? And then I would filter that against, like, well, how do I think demons work? And the point is, you might come to a real sense at some point that, okay, there is a demonic entity present here. And what would you do in that scenario? Is that a fearful scenario? Here's just 3 biblical principles, right? Number 1, we do not interview demons. We speak to people. Right? We've said this before, but just to end it on this thing today. We do not interview demons. We speak to people. Right, flowing from that, we do not seek extra biblical supernatural power over demons. Okay? We don't do any of this kind of like, we got to do the right ritual, or we got to invoke the right prayer, the right words in that prayer. If we don't utter the prayer in the right way, then we're going to be none of that. Okay? That all amounts to basically spells. We don't do spells. What we do is we command demons in the name of Christ to leave and to not come back. And then, number 3, we confront the lies that people have believed with the truth of the gospel. I'm not talking there about winning arguments with people. And I'm not talking about intellectual, cognitive assent. I'm talking about encouraging people to consider who they really think God is, and then meet that with the gospel. So you could ask people things like, when God speaks to you, what does his voice sound like? Or when you picture God, what kind of look does he have on his face? Okay, I'm not asking for someone to write me an essay on, the nature of deity or something. I'm more talking about, who do you really perceive God to be? And then what does the gospel have to say to that? And so ultimately, it's all gospel ministry. That is spiritual warfare.
Gospel ministry.
It's gospel ministry. And some of gospel ministry is confronting the powers of evil and darkness. Okay? And that's it. That's all that can ever be learned about spiritual warfare.